He was loud, rude, and proud of it, talking trash about people who didn't look like him. But what he didn't know was that the man standing silently beside him wasn't just anyone. When the elevator suddenly stopped, so did his mouth. Because what happened next? You'll want to see it for yourself. He was wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, adjusting his tie every few seconds, rehearsing lines under his breath like a man trying to convince himself he belonged. His name was Brian, and today was supposed to be the most important day of his life, a final interview at one of the top production companies in Los Angeles. He'd made it through the first round somehow, bluffing charm and confidence, but this last round was personal, a one-on-one with the company's new silent partner. The name hadn't been revealed. All he knew was, impress this guy. And the job, the power, the respect, the money, it was all his. Brian walked into the lobby with a puffed chest, the kind of confidence that comes from never being challenged. He barely nodded at the receptionist, didn't return the doorman's smile. And when he saw a tall black man in a hoodie waiting for the elevator, he instinctively stepped in front of him like he was invisible. No eye contact. No, excuse me. Just the sound of polished shoes and quiet disrespect. The elevator doors closed. Just the two of them inside. At first, silence. Then Brian started talking, bragging, about his vision, his connections, and then like flipping a switch, the masks came off. He started complaining about how things are changing, about how some people get ahead just because of their skin color. He chuckled. Said he hoped this company still cared about real qualifications. The man beside him stayed quiet. Then the elevator shuddered. A loud thump. It stopped. Lights flickered. Brian hit the button. Nothing. Stuck. Just him. And the man he hadn't even looked at properly. And what Brian didn't know was that the man standing silently beside him was Denzel Washington. Brian sighed loudly, like the universe had inconvenienced him personally. He started pressing every button on the panel, harder and faster, as if force could fix a broken system. Then he looked at the man next to him for the first time, really looked, and rolled his eyes. No recognition, just assumption. Hoodie. Quiet. Calm. To Brian, that equaled nobody. He chuckled again, but now it was sharper, colder. Said something about how typical it was to get stuck in this part of town. Then, without even a glance, he tossed out a line like it was nothing. Well, at least you're not one of the loud ones. He laughed at his own joke. No shame. No hesitation. He was talking to Denzel Washington, one of the most respected actors, humanitarians, and icons of his generation, like he was a janitor who didn't deserve his time. Still, Denzel said nothing. That silence made Brian uncomfortable. So he kept talking. That's what people like him do, fill the space with noise until they feel in control again. He started rambling about the job, about how he'd worked hard to get here, about how he hoped the final interviewer wasn't one of those diversity hires. Said it with a smirk, like it was clever. And still Denzel said nothing, just leaned against the elevator wall, arms crossed, calm as ever. Brian, sensing no challenge, started pacing. He complained about the system, about how people play the race card, and how Hollywood's gone soft, all while standing next to a man whose very life disproved every lie he was telling. But here's the part that makes you lean in. Denzel didn't even flinch, didn't interrupt, didn't correct him. He just let Brian dig the hole deeper and deeper. The audience doesn't know it yet, but that silence, it wasn't passive. It was precision. Minutes ticked by. The elevator didn't budge. Brian checked his watch like the metal box owed him an apology. He muttered about missed opportunities and how people like him didn't have time for breakdowns. That phrase, people like him, floated in the air, loaded and ugly. Denzel stood perfectly still, eyes focused, breathing steady. But behind that quiet, there was movement. Not of anger, not yet something deeper. Patience, precision, presence. Brian finally sat down on the floor, sighing like a victim. And then, almost like he couldn't help himself, he turned to Denzel and asked, "So what do you do?" The tone wasn't curious. It was condescending, like he was doing him a favor just by asking. Denzel looked at him for the first time, just a calm, level glance. "I'm in the business," he said. Brian raised an eyebrow. "Acting? Oh, background stuff?" There it was. The judgment, the assumption, the narrowing of someone's entire existence down to a box he could feel superior to. And it didn't stop there. Brian leaned in like they were equals, like they shared something. He started ranting about how hard it is for real talent to break through these days. Said he was glad he didn't have to dance around all this woke stuff during the earlier interviews. Claimed he was what the company needed. Bold, honest, and not afraid to tell it like it is. Denzel didn't blink. He didn't react. But the weight of that silence was no longer just patience. It was warning. The kind of stillness that only comes from someone who's seen more, lived more, and carries more than people like Brian will ever understand. Brian, oblivious, laughed again. "Anyway, I just hope this last guy isn't one of those overly sensitive types. You know what I mean?" He didn't know. Not yet. But he was about to. 15 minutes. 20. The elevator was still frozen, and so was the mood. Brian started pacing again, this time with real frustration. His shirt was damp under the arms, and his words got sharper, quicker, like a man unraveling under his own arrogance. He kicked the wall once. Hard. "Unbelievable," he muttered. Then he looked at Denzel again, this time with something new in his eyes, suspicion. "You sure you didn't press something?" he asked. It wasn't a question. It was blame, dressed as small talk. Denzel gave a small shake of his head. No words, just quiet. Brian didn't like the quiet anymore. Not in here, not with him. So he kept talking. "Look, nothing personal," he said, his voice trying to sound casual. "But you know how it is. A lot of guys are just trying to get by on handouts. I'm not saying you are, but come on, you have to admit it's easier for some folks now if they check the right boxes." It wasn't just ignorance now. It was entitlement, wrapped in false logic. Brian had built a worldview where he was always the victim, always the one being overlooked. And the man beside him, calm, composed, quietly powerful, shattered that illusion just by existing. Still, Denzel said nothing. Brian started digging again. "Hey, don't get me wrong," he said, with that smirk that always comes before a backhanded insult. "I love black culture. Big fan of Denzel Washington, actually. Guy's a legend, real talent. But not every guy can be Denzel, right?" The irony didn't even register. Denzel didn't move. Brian went on. "Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if I ran into him today. Big shot like that, probably hiding in an office upstairs. That's who I need to impress. Not some junior exec who's just checking a box." The weight of those words hung in the elevator, like a fog, heavy, offensive, unshakable. And for the first time, Brian noticed something. The man beside him wasn't nervous, wasn't irritated, wasn't insecure. He was waiting. For what? Brian didn't know. But he was about to find out. The elevator lights flickered again. A small hum returned to the walls, not movement yet, but a signal that things were about to shift. Brian exhaled, relieved. "Finally," he muttered. Then he turned toward the man one more time and said, "Well, good luck to you, buddy. Hope someone's hiring down on the first floor." He smiled like it was a joke, like he hadn't spent the last half hour dragging every stereotype he could find into the air between them. But this time, for the first time, Denzel responded. Not with anger, not with a speech, just a calm, measured look. And one sentence, "I think I'll be going to the top floor." It hit Brian sideways. He blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. "Oh yeah?" he said, trying to reassert control. "Interview or something?" Denzel held the silence just long enough. Then he nodded. "Something like that." Brian laughed nervously, his voice starting to tremble under the surface. "Well, good for you, man. Gotta hustle out here, right?" No reply. Then came the chime. The elevator jolted, then slowly began rising again, floor by floor, higher and higher. And with every number that blinked past, Brian started to feel smaller. He reached up, fixed his tie again, checked his hair and the metal reflection of the doors. Last round's a big one, he muttered to himself. Just gotta be myself, speak my truth. The elevator slowed. They'd reached the top. Ding! The doors slid open, and on the other side stood two assistants, one holding a clipboard, the other holding a phone. Their eyes went straight to Denzel. "There you are, Mr. Washington. Sorry about the delay." Brian didn't move, didn't speak, didn't breathe. Because in that moment, in that single breath of recognition, everything he thought he knew about the man beside him shattered into silence. Brian's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The blood drained from his face in slow motion as the reality set in. Mr. Washington, Denzel Washington, the man he'd been sitting with, talking down to, mocking, the legend, the icon, the decision maker. The assistants didn't even glance at Brian. All their attention was on Denzel apologizing for the delay, explaining the elevator glitch, offering coffee, water, whatever he needed. But Denzel simply raised a hand and said calmly, "It's fine. I had company." His eyes didn't move toward Brian, not even slightly. But Brian felt it, that invisible weight of exposure, of being fully seen for the first time, not the version he'd crafted, not the polished resume or confident voice, but the man behind it all. Every sentence he'd spoken in that elevator now echoed back at him, each one sharper than the last. He scrambled. "Wait, hold on," he stammered. You're the guy I'm here to interview with?" No answer. He stepped forward. "Two didn't know. I didn't mean anything by look. I was just making conversation." Still no response. Denzel turned slightly, just enough to be heard. Conversation reveals a lot, doesn't it? Then he walked out. The assistants followed. The elevator doors remained open, as if inviting Brian to follow or daring him to. He stepped out slowly, like a man waking up from a long, comfortable lie. Everything about him now looked smaller, the suit, the voice, the confidence. All of it, shrinking under the truth he could no longer hide from. A security guard approached. "Sir, do you have an appointment?" Brian stuttered. "Yeah, interview, final round. I made it through the..." The assistant checked the clipboard, then looked up. There's been a change. No anger, no explanation, just the kind of cold clarity that only truth can bring. And Brian knew. He hadn't just lost a job. He'd been exposed. Not by force, not by shouting, but by standing next to someone who didn't need to say a word because who he was said everything. The hallway outside the elevator was quiet, except for the soft click of polished shoes fading down the corridor. Denzel's exit was smooth, unbothered, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But inside Brian, something had cracked wide open. He didn't walk. He didn't run. He stood frozen in place, caught between two truths, who he thought he was and who he had just revealed himself to be. For the first time all day, there was no swagger, no smirking jokes, no lazy arrogance to fall back on. Just a man alone, exposed, and echoing with the sound of his own words bouncing back at him. He replayed it all in his head, the slurs masked as sarcasm, the assumptions dressed up as insight, the entitlement that dripped from every sentence. All spoken to the very man whose name he'd praised a moment, too late, not out of respect, but to protect himself. He realized then that the man he'd tried to impress with bravado, with confidence, with empty ambition had seen right through him from the first second. Had watched quietly as he unraveled. Not because he needed to win, but because truth doesn't need to argue. Brian looked down the hallway again, hoping to see Denzel still there, maybe waiting, maybe willing to talk. But there was nothing. Just the silence of a door that had already closed. And it wasn't the kind of door you knock on again. He turned around slowly and walked back into the elevator. Same space, same walls, same buttons. But now, everything felt different. Because the man who'd walked in earlier chest high, full of fire, didn't exist anymore. All that was left was the echo of his own reflection. And the truth he couldn't unsee. The elevator doors closed again with a soft whisper. This time, Brian didn't press a button. He just stood there, staring at the panel. But the elevator didn't move. It had nowhere to go, not yet. Then, Almost on instinct, he reached into his pocket to check the company packet, the schedule, the name of the final interviewer, the person he was supposed to impress. He hadn't even looked at it earlier. He was too confident, too sure he didn't need to. But now, his hands shook as he unfolded the paper. His eyes scanned the page. Final interview. Mr. Denzel Washington, partner, executive advisor. Not a rumor, not a surprise guest. His name had been there the whole time, in bold, clear, waiting. Brian could have known. He should have known. But he didn't look because he never thought he needed to. He believed the game was already his to win, and that blind belief had cost him everything. He sank against the wall of the elevator, the same spot Denzel had leaned against, calm and composed, while Brian tore himself down word by word. He looked down at the floor, and that's when he noticed something else. Lying near the corner was a single folded piece of paper, smooth, deliberate, like it had been placed there on purpose. He picked it up. On the front, written in clean, careful script, was a single sentence. People show you who they are. You just have to listen. No signature. He didn't need one, because some lessons don't come with punishment. They come with clarity. Brian stepped out of the building not as a man who'd been fired, but as one who had been revealed, not to the world, not yet, but to himself, and that was worse. The sunlight hit his face, but it didn't feel warm. The city kept moving, cars honking, people on phones, coffee cups in hand, but everything felt quieter somehow, like the volume of the world had been turned down just for him. He walked without a destination, just forward, fast, trying to outrun something you can't leave behind. He checked his phone out of habit. No new calls, no updates, no second chances. He opened his email inbox. Empty. Then refreshed it. Still nothing. And that silence was the loudest response of all. Because the interview hadn't just ended in that hallway. The decision had already been made, and it wasn't just about hiring. It was about character, about presence, about who you are when no one's watching or when you think the person next to you doesn't matter. Brian's mind flicked back to the assistants. Their faces had said everything. Not cruel, not angry, just disappointed, like they'd seen it all before. And maybe they had. But what made this different, what burned the most, was knowing that he hadn't been stopped, corrected, or humiliated in that elevator. He'd been given space to speak, and he'd used that space to expose himself. No one had to ruin his chances. He did that the moment he opened his mouth. Weeks passed. The company never called back. No rejection email, no formal letter, just silence, the kind that doesn't need explanation. Brian applied to other firms, smaller ones, then smaller still, but something had shifted. He could polish the resume, tweak the language, even cut his hair differently, but none of it erased the man he'd met in that elevator. Because the problem wasn't the job he lost. It was the mirror he'd looked into, and what he saw looking back. He stopped bringing it up in conversation, stopped retelling the story. There was no version where he looked like the victim, no clever edit that made him the hero. All he could do was carry it, quietly, like a scar no one else could see, but that never fully healed. And Denzel? He never spoke about it publicly, never tweeted, never mentioned it in interviews, never told the story, because he didn't need to. He had nothing to prove. Some men fight with words, others fight with silence. But the ones who know who they are, who move through the world with grace, grounded in something deeper, they don't fight at all. They wait. They listen. And sometimes, they let the elevator do the talking.